Get her out of here. The voice cracked through the operating room like cold steel, sharp and final, and every head turned at once toward the woman standing just inside the doorway, her dark skin catching the sterile white glare of the overhead lights. A mop still clutched in her hand, as if she had walked into the wrong world by mistake. But Alicia Carter didn't move. Not when the nurses exchanged glances. Not when one of them let out a quiet laugh that echoed louder than it should have. Not when someone muttered, "She cleans floors, not hearts," because her eyes weren't on them. They were locked on the monitor, the jagged rhythm flickering across the screen in uneven spikes. Too fast, too unstable. A pattern she recognized before anyone said a word, before the tension even settled into the room. Her breath slowing as everything else seemed to speed up, the hum of machines, the shuffle of feet, the faint metallic scent in the air, all of it fading behind that single line that refused to steady itself. And then she spoke, her voice low but clear, cutting through the noise without force. "He's not stabilizing. That rhythm's wrong." And for a second, just a second, the room hesitated, but then the laughter came back, sharper this time, dismissive, one nurse shaking her head as she adjusted her gloves. "You lost or something?" And Alicia felt the weight of that moment press against her chest. Not fear, not anger, something older, something heavier, the kind of silence you carry long after you leave. A place that stopped listening to you. But still she didn't step back, her fingers tightening slightly around the handle of the mop as her gaze flicked again to the screen, the numbers climbing, the pattern slipping further out of control, and she said it again, quieter now, but somehow stronger. "You're about to lose him." And that's when Dr. Daniel Hayes finally looked at her, really looked this time, his expression tightening with irritation more than concern, like she was a distraction he didn't have time for. "Security," he said flatly, not even raising his voice, just enough for someone to hear, just enough to make it official, and two orderlies shifted near the door, the movement subtle but final, a line being drawn without anyone needing to explain it. But Alicia didn't turn, didn't leave, because the monitor changed again, a sudden drop, a jagged collapse that made the room inhale all at once, the steady rhythm breaking into something chaotic, something dangerous, and the sound that followed wasn't loud, but it cut deeper than any shout, a warning buried in the machines themselves. And now no one was laughing, not anymore, because something had shifted, something they couldn't ignore, and Alicia took one small step forward, just one, her voice no longer asking to be heard, but stating what she already knew. "It's happening now." The room did not explode into action right away, not like it should have, because hesitation is quiet and deadly in places like this. And for one stretched second, everyone simply stared at the monitor as if willing it to correct itself. But the uneven spikes only grew more erratic, the beeping no longer steady but fractured, breaking apart into sharp, irregular bursts that filled the air with a rising sense of something slipping away. And Dr. Hayes stepped in closer, his gloved hands moving faster now, issuing instructions in clipped, controlled tones that were just a little too tight. "Increase the medication, now," he said, and a nurse rushed to adjust the dosage, her movements precise, but her eyes flicking back to the screen again and again, because the numbers were not responding the way they should, and Alicia could feel it in her chest, that familiar pull of recognition, the kind that did not come from guessing but from knowing, from having seen this pattern before in another room, under another set of lights, long before she ever held a mop. And she tried once more, her voice steady even as everything around her began to tilt toward urgency. "That will not fix it," she said, not louder, not sharper, just certain. And this time a few heads turned, not in amusement, but in discomfort, because certainty from the wrong person unsettles people more than chaos ever could. And one of the younger nurses hesitated, her hand hovering over the controls for just a fraction of a second before continuing anyway, because training told her who to trust, and it was not the woman standing near the door. And Dr. Hayes did not look back again. His focus locked on the patient as he worked, adjusting, correcting, pushing forward as if speed alone could outrun the problem forming beneath his hands. But the monitor did not lie. It stuttered again, dipping, then spiking in a way that made the entire room feel smaller, tighter, the air thinner with every passing second, and Alicia took another step without realizing it, drawn closer not by defiance but by instinct, her eyes tracking every change, every subtle shift that confirmed what she already knew. And then the sound came. A longer tone this time. Not constant, not final, but dangerously close. And it froze the room in a different way than laughter ever could, because now there was no room for pride, no space for dismissal. Only the creeping realization that something was going wrong faster than anyone wanted to admit. And Dr. Hayes's voice sharpened, losing its calm edge as he spoke again. Why is it not stabilizing? He demanded, not to anyone in particular, just to the room itself, to the situation slipping through his control, and no one answered. Because no one had an answer that fit the moment, and Alicia felt the weight of that silence press in, heavy and familiar, the kind of silence that follows when truth is standing in the wrong place. And she inhaled slowly, the sterile air cool in her lungs, grounding her, steadying the tremor that threatened to rise in her hands. And then she said it, not as a suggestion, not as a warning, but as a fact that had already arrived. You are treating the symptom, not the cause. And this time the words did not disappear into laughter. They landed, solid and undeniable, hanging in the space between machines and motion. And for the first time since she had spoken, Dr. Hayes paused, just long enough for the rhythm of the room to falter, just long enough for doubt to slip in where certainty had been. And when he finally turned his head toward her, his eyes were no longer irritated, they were searching, and that was the moment everything began to change. Dr. Hayes did not speak right away, and that silence carried more weight than any command he had given before, because now the room was no longer moving with certainty, but with hesitation, and hesitation in a place like this felt like standing on the edge of something you could not see. His eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Alicia, not her uniform, not the mop still leaning against the wall behind her, but her face, the calm that did not match the chaos unfolding around them. And for a brief second it unsettled him more than the failing rhythm on the monitor. What do you mean? He asked finally, his voice lower now, controlled but no longer dismissive, and Alicia stepped closer again, just enough for the light to fully catch her expression, steady, focused, as if she had already stepped into a different role the moment she understood what was happening, her gaze flicking to the screen, then back to him. You are chasing the rate, she said, each word deliberate. But the electrical pathway is misfiring. It is not responding because you are not correcting the source. And a murmur moved through the room, not loud, but present, a ripple of uncertainty passing from one person to another as the ideas settled in. Because what she said was not random, it was specific, precise in a way that did not belong to guesswork. And one of the nurses glanced at Dr. Hayes, waiting for him to shut it down, to reassert control. But he did not immediately. Because something in her tone did not allow it, something that made ignoring her feel riskier than listening. And he turned back to the monitor, scanning it again, this time not just reacting but reconsidering. The pattern suddenly looking different now that doubt had entered the room. The spikes no longer just fast but erratic in a way that suggested something deeper, something he had not accounted for, and his jaw tightened slightly as he processed it. The realization not fully formed but beginning to take shape. And behind him, the beeping grew sharper again, the intervals uneven, pressing against the edges of time itself, and Alicia did not rush, did not raise her voice. She simply continued, if you do not reset it now, you will not get another chance. And that was when the tension snapped, not into panic, but into decision, because hesitation could not stretch any further without breaking everything. And Dr. Hayes exhaled once, slow and controlled, before speaking again, this time not to dismiss her, but to test her. What would you do? He asked, the words hanging in the air heavier than any order, and every person in that room felt it, the shift in power, subtle but undeniable, because the question itself changed everything. And Alicia met his gaze without flinching, without hesitation, the answer already there, waiting, as if she had never stopped knowing it. I would correct the signal before you lose the rhythm completely, she said, and for the first time since she had entered the room, no one laughed, no one moved to remove her, because something deeper than protocol had taken hold, something that did not care about titles or uniforms, only about what was true. And Dr. Hayes stared at her for one more second, measuring, weighing everything he thought he knew against the reality in front of him. And then, quietly, almost imperceptibly, he stepped half an inch to the side, not fully, not completely, but enough to open a space that had not existed before, and in that small movement, the entire room felt the ground shift beneath them. Alicia did not rush into the space that had opened for her, not like someone desperate to prove herself, but like someone who understood exactly how little time remained, her steps measured, controlled, the soft sound of her shoes against the polished floor almost drowned out by the uneven beeping that continued to fracture the room's rhythm. And as she moved closer to the table, the nurses instinctively shifted, not fully stepping aside at first, but creating just enough room without realizing. They were doing it, their eyes following her hands, her posture, the quiet confidence that did not match the uniform she wore. And Dr. Hayes remained where he was, watching closely now, not interrupting, not commanding, just observing as if trying to understand how this moment had changed so quickly. And Alicia reached the monitor, her gaze sweeping across the data. With a familiarity that settled into the room like a truth no one had prepared for, her fingers hovering for a brief second before adjusting a setting with precise care, not guessing, not hesitating, and she spoke again, her voice calm, steady, guiding rather than correcting. You need to reset the pathway before the signal collapses completely. And one of the nurses glanced at Dr. Hayes as if waiting for confirmation, but he did not give one, not because he agreed yet, but because something deeper had taken over, something that told him this was no longer about authority. It was about survival, and the monitor responded almost immediately, not dramatically, not with a sudden fix, but with a subtle shift, a change in the pattern that was small but undeniable, enough to pull every eye in the room back to the screen, enough to silence the last remnants of doubt. And Alicia continued, her focus unwavering. It will not stabilize on its own. You have to guide it back. And this time, no. One questioned her. No one laughed. Because the evidence was right there in front of them, unfolding in real time. And Dr. Hayes stepped slightly closer again, not to take over, but to see, to understand what she was seeing, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier edge. What are you correcting? He asked, and Alicia did not look at him as she answered, her attention fixed on the task. The signal is out of sync. You are treating the response, not the origin. And the words settled into the space between them, heavy with meaning. And for a moment the only sound was the monitor, still uneven but no longer collapsing. Each beat a fragile step back from the edge, and the nurses moved more deliberately now, not out of routine but out of trust, following her direction without needing it repeated, their earlier certainty replaced by something more careful, more aware. And Alicia's hands remained steady, her breathing even, as if the chaos around her could not reach her, as if she had stood in this exact place before and learned how to quiet everything except what mattered. And Dr. Hayes watched her closely, the realization growing stronger with every second, because this was not instinct alone. This was training, experience, something earned over years that could not be explained by chance. And the thought formed slowly but clearly in his mind, challenging everything he had assumed the moment she walked into the room. And he spoke again, almost to himself, but loud enough for her to hear. Where did you learn this? And Alicia paused just long enough for the question to land, her eyes still on the monitor, the faintest shift in her expression passing like a shadow across her face, something deeper, something personal. And then she answered, her voice quiet but unshakable, right here. And the room fell into a different kind of silence. Not confusion, not doubt, but the kind that comes when the truth arrives before anyone is ready for it. The words lingered in the air longer than anyone expected, settling into the room with a weight that no machine could measure. And for a moment, even the monitor seemed quieter, its rhythm still fragile, but no longer collapsing. Each beat stretching a fraction further apart from the chaos it had been trapped in just seconds before. And Dr. Hayes felt something shift inside him. Not relief, not yet, but a crack in the certainty he had carried into this room, because nothing about this made sense. Unless he let go of what he thought he knew, and Alicia did not look at him again, her focus returning fully to the work in front of her, her hands moving with steady precision as she adjusted another setting, guiding the rhythm instead of forcing it. And the change came slowly but unmistakably, the jagged spikes beginning to smooth, the intervals finding a pattern that had been lost, and one of the nurses leaned in closer, her eyes widening as she watched the screen. "It is responding," she said under her breath, not announcing it, just acknowledging what she could not deny. And another nurse nodded without speaking, her earlier confidence replaced by careful attention, following Alicia's movements without question, because now the results were visible, undeniable, unfolding right in front of them. And the room, once filled with quiet laughter, had transformed into something else entirely, something focused, almost reverent, as if they were witnessing a process they did not fully understand but could not interrupt. And Alicia's breathing remained even, her posture relaxed but controlled, as if she had learned long ago that panic did not belong in moments like this. Only clarity, only presence. And Dr. Hayes stepped closer again, not to reclaim control, but to see from her angle, to understand what she was doing differently. His voice softer now, almost cautious. "You are stabilizing the pathway before the rhythm resets," he said, more to confirm than to question, and Alicia gave a slight nod without looking up. "If you wait for it to fix itself, it will not," she replied, her tone steady, and that answer carried more than instruction. It carried experience, the kind that comes from having watched this happen before, from knowing what happens when you hesitate too long. And the realization settled deeper into Dr. Hayes's mind, pressing against every assumption he had made, every judgment formed in a single glance. And the monitor continued its slow transformation, the erratic pattern giving way to something more consistent, more stable, each beat now landing where it should, not perfect, but strong enough to hold. And the tension in the room shifted again, not gone, but easing, like a tight grip finally beginning to loosen, and one of the nurses exhaled quietly, a breath she had been holding without realizing it. And Alicia made one final adjustment, her movements deliberate, precise, as if placing the last piece of something fragile back into alignment. And then she stepped back half a step, not fully withdrawing, just enough to observe, to confirm that the change would hold, her eyes fixed on the monitor as the rhythm steadied further. And the sound that filled the room now was different, no longer sharp or fractured, but consistent. A steady reminder that they had pulled back from something they almost lost. And for a moment no one spoke, not because they did not have words, but because none of them felt right. And Dr. Hayes stood there, his gaze moving from the monitor to Alicia, the weight of what had just happened settling heavily into his chest, and he realized that this was not a coincidence, not luck, not instinct alone. This was something else entirely, something he had overlooked, dismissed, almost removed from the room entirely. And the thought settled in fully now, undeniable and uncomfortably clear. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of its earlier authority, only quiet recognition. "You knew exactly what to do," he said. And Alicia remained still, her eyes still on the steady rhythm, her expression calm. But there was something in her silence, something that suggested this was not the first time she had known and not been heard. The steady rhythm on the monitor continued, each measured beat echoing softly through the room like a second chance no one had expected. And yet the tension did not disappear, it only changed shape, settling into the quiet spaces between breaths, between glances, between thoughts that no one dared to say out loud. And Alicia remained where she was for a moment longer, watching, not trusting the stability too quickly, because she knew better than anyone how fragile recovery could be, how easily something could slip again if you assumed too much. And only when the pattern held for several long seconds did she finally step back, slowly, deliberately, creating distance between herself and the table as if returning to a place she had never truly left, her hands lowering to her sides, relaxed but still, as the room adjusted to a new kind of silence, one that was no longer driven by fear, but by realization. And the nurses exchanged brief glances, not the kind filled with doubt or dismissal, but something quieter, more uncertain, as if they were recalibrating everything they thought they understood about the person standing among them. And Dr. Hayes did not move immediately, his eyes still fixed on the monitor, confirming what he already knew, that the rhythm was holding, that the danger had passed for now. And when he finally turned to Alicia again, there was no trace of the authority he had used earlier, only a careful awareness, as though he was speaking to someone he had just Met for the first time? You stepped in at exactly the right moment, he said, his voice low, almost reflective, and Alicia did not answer right away, her gaze drifting briefly to the polished floor beneath her feet, where faint reflections of light stretched across the surface she had been cleaning just minutes before, the same floor that now seemed like a different world entirely. And when she finally spoke, her tone was calm, but there was a depth behind it that made the words land heavier than expected. There is always a moment, she said. You just have to recognize it before it passes. And that answer settled into Dr. Hayes's mind with quiet force, because it was not just about this situation. It was about something larger, something that extended beyond this room, beyond this one patient. And he studied her more closely now, not searching for confirmation, but for understanding, because the gap between what she appeared to be and what she had just done was too wide to ignore. And the room seemed to hold its breath again, not in fear, but in anticipation of something unspoken, something that had been building since the moment she walked in. And Alicia turned slightly, her eyes moving toward the doorway, toward the place where she had been standing at the edge just minutes before, her posture shifting subtly, as if she was preparing to step back into that space, to return to the role everyone had already assigned to her. And one of the nurses hesitated, watching her, as if unsure whether to say something, to stop her, but the words did not come, because none of them knew what to say anymore. And Dr. Hayes took a small step forward, the movement quiet but intentional, as if he was about to ask something more, something that mattered beyond this moment. And Alicia paused, just briefly, her hand brushing lightly against the handle of the mop she had left near the wall, the simple object grounding her in a reality that felt distant and immediate at the same time. And in that stillness, the contrast between who she was seen as and who she had just proven herself to be hung in the air, unresolved, waiting for someone to finally acknowledge it out loud. Dr. Hayes stopped just short of speaking, the question forming in his mind heavier than anything he had said all night, because now it was no longer about what had happened. It was about who had made it happen. And Alicia's hand rested lightly on the mop handle, her fingers curling around it with a familiarity that felt almost symbolic, as if she was deciding which version of herself the room would allow her to be. And the silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but charged, filled with a realization that no one could ignore anymore. And finally Dr. Hayes spoke, his voice quieter than before, stripped of assumption. You said you learned this here, he said, not as a challenge, but as a need to understand. And Alicia turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze for the first time since stepping away from the table, her eyes steady, not defensive, not proud, just honest. And for a brief moment the room seemed to narrow around that exchange, as if everything else had faded into the background. And she exhaled softly before answering. I did not just learn it here, she said, her tone even. I let it here. And the words landed with a quiet force that rippled through the room, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. And the nurses glanced at each other again, confusion replacing the certainty they once held, because nothing about that statement aligned with what they thought they knew. And Dr. Hayes felt his chest tighten slightly, not from doubt, but from the weight of recognition beginning to form. You were a surgeon, he said, the realization coming out slower than expected, as if saying it aloud made it more real. And Alicia nodded once, a small, controlled movement that carried more history than she chose to reveal. Cardiac, she added, her voice steady, and the words seemed to settle into every corner of the room, filling the gaps left by assumption. And for a moment no one spoke, because the shift was too large to process all at once. The image of the woman they had dismissed colliding with the truth standing in front of them, and Dr. Hayes's gaze dropped briefly, his mind retracing every second since she walked in, every glance, every word, every decision, and the realization settled deeper with each step back through memory. And when he looked up again, there was something different in his expression, something closer to humility than authority. Why are you not in there? He asked quietly, gesturing toward the table, toward the place where she had just done what no one else could. And Alicia's eyes flickered for a moment, not away, but inward, as if the answer lived somewhere she did not visit often. And when she spoke, her voice did not change, but something beneath it did, something heavier. Because the last time I stood there, she said, slowly, no one listened until it was too late. And the room went still again. But this time the silence carried understanding, not confusion, and the monitor continued its steady rhythm in the background, a quiet reminder of what had been saved and what had nearly been lost, and Dr. Hayes absorbed her words without interruption, the weight of them settling into him in a way that left no room for defense. Only reflection, and Alicia's grip on the mop loosened slightly as she shifted her stance, not retreating, not advancing, simply standing in the truth she had revealed, and in that moment, the difference between who she had been seen as and who she truly was could no longer be ignored, not by anyone in that room. The words did not fade after Alicia spoke them. They settled, deep and unmovable, filling the room in a way that no instruction ever could, and for a long moment no one reached for anything, no one adjusted a dial or checked a chart, because something more important had taken hold, something that forced everyone to look inward before they could look anywhere else. And Dr. Hayes stood there with his hand half raised, the gesture unfinished, as if he had intended to say something sooner, but now understood that anything rushed would only cheapen what had just been revealed, and the steady rhythm of the monitor continued behind them, calm, consistent, almost gentle now, a quiet contrast to the tension that had once filled every inch of the room, and he lowered his hand slowly, his posture shifting in a way that was subtle but unmistakable, the confidence still there, but no longer rigid, no longer closed. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried something new, something unguarded. "I should have listened," he said, not loudly, not performative, just honest, and the admission did not echo. It did not need to, because everyone in the room heard it clearly, and the nurses exchanged glances again. But this time there was no confusion, only recognition, the kind that comes when truth replaces assumption, and Alicia remained still, her hand no longer gripping the mop, resting lightly against it instead, as if it was simply an object now, not a definition. And she looked at Dr. Hayes for a brief moment, not with judgment, not with triumph, but with something quieter, something closer to understanding, because she had heard those words before, in different forms, in different rooms, always arriving just a little too late, and she gave a small nod, not accepting an apology, not rejecting it, simply acknowledging that it existed, and Dr. Hayes took a step closer, the distance between them no longer marked by roles but by respect, and he spoke again, slower this time, choosing each word carefully. "You saved that patient," he said, and Alicia's eyes shifted briefly toward the monitor, the steady line confirming what he had said without needing to repeat it, and she responded softly, "We did." And that single correction carried more weight than any praise, because it removed the separation that had existed only minutes before, and the room seemed to breathe again, the tension easing not into relief, but into something more lasting, something that would remain after this moment ended. And one of the nurses stepped forward slightly, her voice hesitant but sincere. "We did not know," she said, and Alicia met her gaze for a second, her expression calm. "You did not ask," she replied, not as an accusation, but as a fact, and the simplicity of it settled deeper than anything else, because it was not about this one moment, it was about every moment before it. And Dr. Hayes looked around the room, taking in the faces of his team, the shift that had passed through all of them, and then back at Alicia, and there was no hesitation left in him now, only clarity. "You should not be standing with a mop," he said quietly, and Alicia's lips curved just slightly, not quite a smile, but something close, something that held both truth and restraint, and she adjusted her grip on the handle again, lifting it just an inch off the floor before setting it back down gently, the sound soft but grounding. "Sometimes," she said, her voice steady, "people only see what they expect to see." And the words lingered in the air, not as a lesson, not as a statement to prove, but as something lived, something earned, and no one in that room could look at her the same way again, because the image they had formed was gone, replaced by something real, something undeniable, and in the quiet that followed, respect took the place where doubt once stood. The room did not return to what it had been before. It could not, because something fundamental had shifted in a way that could not be undone, and the steady rhythm of the monitor continued to fill the space with a quiet assurance. Each measured beat a reminder of how close everything had come to slipping away, and Alicia stood there for one last moment, her gaze resting on the screen not out of pride, but out of habit, the kind built over years of watching, waiting, confirming that stability was real before allowing herself to step back. And when she finally turned, it was not dramatic, not slow, just a simple movement toward the corner where she had left her place, her role, her silence, and the mop leaned where she had set it down earlier, unchanged, ordinary, as if none of this had happened, and she reached for it with the same calm precision she had used moments before, her fingers wrapping around the handle as naturally as if it belonged there, and the sound of it touching the floor again was soft, almost lost beneath the steady beeping behind her, and no one stopped her, not because they did not want to, but because they did not yet know how, because what words could follow what had just been revealed without feeling too small, too late. And Dr. Hayes watched her as she began to move across the floor again, the motion slow, deliberate, the reflection of the overhead lights stretching beneath her with each pass. And the contrast was impossible to ignore. The same hands that had just guided something so critical now returning to a task so easily overlooked, and it stayed with him. That image, that contradiction, settling deeper than anything he had experienced in that room before, and he took a step forward as if to speak, to say something that could bridge the gap between what had been and what should be. But the words did not come immediately, because this was not a moment for correction. It was a moment for understanding, and Alicia did not look back, not because she was unaware, but because she had already said everything that needed to be said, not in words, but in action, and the nurses stood where they were, their eyes following her quietly. The earlier laughter now replaced by something heavier, something closer to reflection, and one of them lowered her gaze briefly, as if replaying the moment she had dismissed the voice that ultimately saved the situation. And the realization settled into each of them differently, but it stayed, and the room itself felt changed, not in its structure, not in its equipment, but in the awareness that now lived within it. And Alicia continued her work, the motion steady, consistent, each pass of the mop smoothing the surface beneath her as the light shifted across the floor, and behind her the monitor maintained its calm rhythm, a quiet, persistent sound that no longer demanded attention, only acknowledgement. And after a few seconds she paused, just briefly, her hand